Good morning. So I have the terrible flu that is going around, which is why I'm unable to join in person, but also I have no voice. Since this is a disability crowd, I am relying on voice to speak technology. Thank you for your patience. I am honored to be a part of the American Association on Health and Disability as the Director of Research. Today, I'm going to be talking about disability inclusion and representation in implementation science research. Today, I am wearing a black suit jacket and red shirt, and not seen on screen, I am sitting in a manual wheelchair with my service dog Cabo nearby. My pronouns are she, her, hers. A brief note about providing a self description. This is one way that we both signal inclusivity and demonstrate the promotion of greater access for all. For individuals who are blind or low vision, there are important visuals that they often miss out on. And in a large group such as this, I am not aware of all attendees' disability status. And considering 67 million Americans self identify as having a disability, or 1 in 4, we must assume that someone in this room is likely to have that access need. And rather than expecting that person to request accommodations, providing accessible materials in advance, and including things like an access note like this, demonstrates inclusivity upfront and proactively. I have no disclosures. Here are our learning objectives. For those who do not know us, AAHD is an incredible organization whose mission is to advance health equity for people with disabilities through policy, research, education, and dissemination. I joined AAHD in July of this year after serving in the federal government as the director of the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, NIDLR. One of my favorite quotes is from the late Judy Heumann, was a powerhouse, a personal mentor, and friend of mine. Judy said, "I want to see feisty disabled people change the world." What better advice is there than that? Especially for the rehabilitation, medicine, and public health fields too. I think about both her legacy and this quote often in my role, as I have been committed for years to work hard to transform our society, especially the research enterprise to be more inclusive of people with disabilities throughout all processes. This is no easy task, but for far too long, the world of rehabilitation and public health research has been dominated by predominantly white, cisgender, non-disabled male voices and researchers. Even beyond the focus of the research world, much in the broader rehabilitation world, clinical programs and policies and healthcare systems have been built based on the majority, not the minority. And it takes leaders like all of us in this room to challenge the status quo. So, in the vein of challenging the status quo, it is important to be transparent about one's identities. My identities I wear proudly include Paralympic medalist, Indian adoptee, disabled wheelchair woman, person of color, researcher, and activist. A couple roles ago, I was on faculty at Vanderbilt Univ, where I primarily studied disability identity development. Nothing about my disability journey has been simple, and as I reflect on my life's journey, I was constantly intrigued by and studying disability identity and meaning making around disability representation at every step along the way. As a young child, I thought everybody in the world had a disability and that it was a phase I would outgrow. I never realized that disabled children grew up into disabled adults. Spoiler alert, they do. I also thought in order to grow up and go to college, have a job, start a family, live on my own, I first had to learn how to walk. Why? Nearly every adult I knew could walk. Therefore, in my mind, I held this assumption that in order to gain access to these opportunities, I had to make my disability disappear. I felt invisible, and this lack of representation around me is what led to this assumption. I remember the day crying in the bushes at preschool when I was watching my classmates on the playground and the swings and monkey bars. And there was something about that moment when I realized this disability thing was here to stay. I realized in that low moment, I could let society's expectations, or really lack of expectations for myself, dictate my life. But I knew that wasn't going to get me anywhere. Fortunately, I grew up just outside of Boston, where as a young girl I saw wheelchair racers from the Boston Marathon go flying by, and I learned through the power of example that people with disabilities could thrive, work, succeed athletically and in life. I latched onto the role models from that moment, dressed up as winner of Boston Marathon for Halloween. Asserted in the 6th grade I was going to go to the University of Illinois and become a Paralympian. It's strange to me and cool how many of those goals I set for myself throughout childhood came true. This lack of representation was tough for me as a child, and something that I think about often as I am leading AAHD's research. I am proud to be a disabled person leading our research. While I was starting to understand that representation mattered, it was still a bit of a mess to sort out, and has become such a part of my life's work to research this. Be that representation for others, and help empower and educate about disability representation. I was fortunate that involvement in disability sport gave me a strong disability community, and peers and role models to develop my own disability identity. Life with a disability is complicated. There are some days I'm so proud of it as a part of my identity and who I am, and yet there are other days when it is a source of frustration. Although I started high school nearly a decade after the Americans with Disabilities Act became law, my school was not accessible. It was deeper than the physical barriers were the attitudinal barriers, and the naysayers of those who doubted in my abilities because of my disability, which led to me taking on my school district in federal court. Unfortunately, there were many examples. Why do you want to take astronomy class in the planetarium? You're not actually interested in science, are you? Or the English teacher? Why are you in an honors level English class? It's not like you can go to college anyway. Sorry, Anjali, you are danger to the other students. You may no longer participate in gym class. Would love to show them these Paralympic medals. I share these experiences because unfortunately, even in 2025, many of these things still happen to the patients and young people you work with and affect their families. The experience of growing up with a disability is different from acquiring it. One is not easier than another. The impacts and experiences are just different. Growing up with a disability means a lifetime of these types of encounters of ableism, often before you have the brain development to fully process them. Anti-ableism is strategies and practices that challenge and counter ableism itself for inequalities, prejudices, and discrimination because of disability. In order to challenge, study, and dismantle ableism, we must have an understanding of ableism itself. Talia Lewis's definition of ableism is here on the screen. A self-identified Black, disabled lawyer, educator, and organizer. A system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas have deep and complicated roots. Said in a different way, Campbell explains that ableism refers to the beliefs, practices, and policies that tolerate and promote the unequal treatment of people based on actual or presumed disabilities. Disability identity can be described as a sense of self that includes one's disability and feelings of connection to or solidarity with the disability. Community. A coherent disability identity is believed to help individuals adapt to disability, including navigating related social stresses and daily hassles. Disability identity shapes the way individuals see themselves, their bodies, and interactions with their surroundings. People with disabilities not only have to navigate physical components of their disability, but also what social meaning is attributed to that disability. These physical and social aspects combine to form a person's disability identity, which should be considered both in relation to other intersectional identities such as LGBTQ, racial identity, cultural identity, etc., and also should be considered independent of other aspects of identity. I really wanted to be able to better understand the experience of disability and developing a disability identity to figure out how we could tailor our interventions to better support disabled people. How do you know when a person is struggling with their disability identity? Is there a difference between being born with a disability like cerebral palsy versus acquiring disability later in life? Is disability identity an antidote to ableism? And if so, how do we foster or nurture and grow that? What makes it so one person has a strong disability identity versus another? These were some of the many questions I sought to answer with my own line of research. And I did a lot of this work and have much more still to do. We started off with a systematic literature review. We learned that disability identity is relatively understudied compared to other social identities, and the literature mostly focuses on adults with disabilities. I was dismayed that of the 41 empirical studies, because there were a lot of studies about disability identity that didn't include data from participants with disabilities. Eye roll. I was dismayed that only 9 had a sample size of more than 100 participants. I'd like to remind you all that there are 67 million Americans with disabilities in the US. Then we conducted a series of empirical studies to both provide us with a framework for the key components of disability identity, with the ultimate accidental goal of developing and validating a measure on disability identity development, because in order to answer the questions I wanted to, you needed a measurement tool to do that. Our framework here has been refined a bit over time and views disability identity as a unique phenomenon that shapes individuals' ways of looking at themselves, their bodies, and how they interact with the world. The developmental statuses are internal beliefs about own disability and the disability community, anger and frustration with disability experiences, adoption of disability community values and contribution to the disability community. Importantly, these are statuses, not stages, so this is not a linear model. The decades of my work in this area have meant that I've grappled with how we can honor and promote disability representation and disability identity. Across the research enterprise, These concepts are fundamentally important for disabled scientists too. As another layer to this all, there's a thing called disability hierarchy. Disability hierarchy is a social construct that makes certain kinds of disabilities more acceptable than others. This happens both within the disability community and among people outside the disability community, making judgments about who is or is not valued most within the broad spectrum of disability, and who is or is not accepted most. At the top of this hierarchy, you see physical disability with a notable exception. Those with facial abnormalities are not viewed as acceptable. Followed by chronic illness, with notable exception of those living with HIV/AIDS, followed by learning, sensory, cognitive, neurodevelopmental, intellectual, and psychiatric disabilities. These ones at the bottom here are the most highly stigmatized, again, both within the disability community itself and by society itself. Also, if you have more than one disability, you may have compounded effects of this hierarchy in action, or feel or experience ableism for one of your disabilities more so than another. I encourage you to think about this in your own work and profession too. Even the field of rehabilitation has historically really focused and valued most just those with physical disability. This likely contributes to maintaining the hierarchy of disability, something that I believe we must work hard to dismantle. A set of unearned privileges held by people without disabilities. This is another important term for the conversation today. We must be aware of the experiences of those with disabilities who experience ableism and the hierarchy in action, and those without disabilities who hold certain privileges because of their non-disabled status. I share these terms because they are all at play here in 2025, and they affect us as a field trying to grow and cultivate the next generation of researchers and clinicians too. If individuals with disabilities are discouraged from going to college or being involved in research or clinical careers in the first place, let alone pursuing advanced degrees, then they are excluded from our profession. This exclusion is often because of these systemic barriers that reinforce the ableism that we've been talking about. This is ability-based privilege in action. I have been committed to enhancing the involvement of people with disabilities across the research enterprise, from the investigators to the reviewers to the project officers. These goals include increasing the representation of researchers with disabilities across funding mechanisms and all agencies and sectors. When at NIDLR, we worked on this across NIDLR mechanisms, deeply integrated in NIDLR's long-range plan, including data about PIs with disabilities in public talks, and in our reports to Congress, all with the goal of also increasing the number of disabled researchers of color and from other underrepresented backgrounds, and deepening the rehabilitation training field trajectory. When I entered the academy, both as a student and then even as an early career researcher, and even now mid-career, I once again found the lack of representation to be dismal, something that is one of my personal goals to continue to work on improving, to be that feisty change that is needed to bring more inclusion and equity to the research world. It is important to talk about this from three perspectives: diverse researchers as researchers or as the generators of the science, and diverse individuals as study participants, and diverse representation in the knowledge translation materials we produce and disseminate about the research. We need all of these, and we are stronger for them. Our science is better with this intentionality, and it makes people feel seen by the research we are doing and signals its relevancy. Let's talk about some data, and let's mark this moment in time when these data are disappearing, and support for underrepresented minorities in research is also disappearing in real time. It is going to make these types of analyses presented very challenging to look at in terms of trends. Make no mistake, disability is very much under attack right now. Without data as evidence, there's no accountability. And without accountability, they can dismantle protections for disabled people and disabled researchers without public backlash. Here's some data from NSF on the STEM workforce 2011 to 2021. We've made some slight improvements in the past decade in terms of gender and racial gaps. But when we look at disability, that is indicated in the tiny blue sliver. Only 3% of STEM workforce identifies with one or more disability, and this has remained unchanged. Dr. Bonnie Swenner said in an interview, "This persistent exclusion of people with disabilities has gotten relatively little attention, symbolic of how deep the barriers are. There needs to be much more urgency to address this issue, as a large number of people are locked out of research careers, and we are clearly not doing enough to change that. I call on us, as the public health, rehabilitation, and medical field, to do something about this. I'm also struck by, one, how hard it is to find statistics about disabled researchers. This is only going to get worse. Disabled people represent approximately 9% of the scientific workforce, according to the Advisory Committee to the Director of NIH report from the Subgroup on Disability. Data from the Women, Minorities, and Persons with Disabilities in Science and Engineering. 2021 report indicate that disability representation in the scientific workforce decreases throughout the career path. 19% of undergraduate students, 9% of doctoral students, 8% of postdoctoral students, 8% of assistant professors, 10% of associate and full professors, 8% of department directors, chairs, and chancellors, 8% of university presidents and provosts. Just under 5% of medical students and approximately 3% of practicing physicians report disability. So, even if we are getting disabled people in the door to the scientific workforce, we aren't keeping them or supporting them to grow in their careers. In the government, recent advisory committee to the director of NIH report indicated less than 2% of principal investigators funded by the National Institutes of Health report having a disability. NIDLR reported this PI disability data based on number of existing grants in its portfolio. In FY23, 51 grants were led by principal investigators who reported they have disabilities out of 261 grants, 19.5%. These numbers are discouraging, given that 25.7% of American adults, roughly approximately 67 million, are disabled. Again, I call on us all to ask, how can we do better? We must deepen disability inclusion expectations, foster discussions about disability identity, and create inclusive research and clinical spaces. For example, if we are collecting demographic data, are we remembering to include disability too? To include people with disabilities across the research enterprise also means talking about and encouraging the talking about the disability identity of individuals, and building inclusive research spaces where investigators and staff with disabilities are integral members of the research team and on the federal team of project officers and research administrators. Going back to the data, the gross underrepresentation of people with disabilities in the scientific research workforce is either reflective of the exclusion of people with disability throughout the research pipeline or reflective of the stigma attached to revealing a disability. Regardless, low representation of people with disabilities in research careers remains a barrier. I was thrilled that this was a key priority area of many agencies to meaningfully address. And this is all very much in jeopardy, which, make no mistake, will have ramifications affecting the glimmer of progress I'm presenting here for decades to come. Again, I call on us all to ask, how can we do better? Also, I want to underscore the opportunity that exists for all to be a part of research teams, even if not pursuing formal higher education degrees. Your voice matters, and you should be providing input and participating on research teams to help to ensure that the research being conducted is relevant to us and our communities, and that it is answering actual problems or gaps that we encounter in our lives. Society's lack of expectations on people with disabilities have led to these discrepancies and these abysmal numbers. Therefore, this is one of the changes I have taken up in my role to try to address where we can, and encourage you all to do the same in your respective roles. I also want to note that I have a very visible disability. I cannot hide it, except a bit on Zoom where I have had to learn I have to disclose it. But there are many individuals who have less apparent or hidden disabilities, who also grapple with the layer of disclosure every single day. Is it safe for me to disclose my disability? Will I be treated differently? Will I receive the research mentoring I need to succeed? During graduate school, I fiercely tried to separate research from my personal experience of disability, a challenge some students may relate to. However, mentors urged me to merge these aspects. This empowered me to combine academic and personal perspectives, which enhanced my research's quality. Embracing this duality, I found a fulfilling space where my lived experiences strengthened my work. I invite you to join me in this transformative approach. Despite your research background, your unique identity and lens contribute significantly. I encourage you to include statements about your disability status in your work when and where safe to do so. It fosters visibility and inspires future generations. Boldly owning our identities as advocated in the disability community resonates with audiences, humanizing our research and its impact. I also want to plant the seed and encourage everyone to be brave enough to include positionality statements about not just your own disability status, but also your team's disability status. This is a hard ask in the climate we are in now, but there is a group of us that is what we say in the disability community is being loud and proud. And this outward claiming of identities, when and where safe to do so, will help to make the less apparent more apparent and give confidence to students, trainees who might not realize this could be a career path for them. If we want to really move the needle on representation and transform the research enterprise, we must boldly claim our identities, loud and proud, as they say in the disability community. This signals so much to future generations, to the consumers of your work, to the populations in your studies too. It humanizes the work. People with disabilities confront multiple barriers to inclusion and participation in the research workforce. These barriers can be societal, attitudinal, physical, or systemic. We have talked about many of them today already. These barriers are compounded for people with disabilities who are from one or more underserved communities. The societal and/or attitudinal barriers are rooted in systemic ableism and racism. I see and have experienced the financial disparities that intersect with being disabled that affect me versus my non-disabled friends. For example, it costs more to rent apartments that are accessible because oftentimes they are newer construction or have to be on public transit lines. These financial hardships are compounded being from a Black or Brown community. As researchers, Black and Brown scientists are tasked with far more service labor than others. We are also previously used to being the poster children for our universities or employers, especially if you have a visible disability and are a person of color to show the commitment to diversity. These costs, commonly referred to the disability tax, are very real, are also exponentially higher if you have higher support needs. Intersectionality, coined by Crenshaw, is a framing to exploring the interconnectedness of different statuses in relation to embedded systems of power, privilege, and oppression. This work acknowledges complexities in the social construction of identities and lived experiences within interlocking systems of inequality. We cannot be afraid to name these systemic barriers what they are. What are the systemic barriers you faced, your peers, your students, and how can we work together to dismantle them? Even if you do not identify as disabled or from an underrepresented community, you can be an ally. As a researcher, I began to see many of these same attitudinal barriers in the systems of research that likely prevent or prohibit or make more challenging to have disabled participants in our studies, or to support disabled students as junior researchers. From everything of the derogatory and insulting language adopted by the Institutional Review Board forms, to disability not being important enough to include as a key demographic variable. I had a graduate student who couldn't submit her IRB document because the submit button wasn't coded properly to be screen reader compatible. The value of inclusive research cannot be underestimated. Inclusive research allows for traditionally silenced voices to be raised and to help shape the research being conducted. By inviting and encouraging these voices throughout the processes, this adds depth, relevancy, and nuances that could be missed otherwise. Those with the lived experience of disability navigate the world uniquely and often encounter ableism. Those with the lived experience of being a racial minority navigate the world uniquely and encounter racism. Those with the lived experience of being from LGBTQ+ community navigate the world uniquely and encounter homophobia. Yet, these experiences can be valuable to better understand the overarching context, barriers, and challenges, and to design interventions that avoid perpetuating those isms or silencing certain voices, involving people from diverse backgrounds and intersections of those identities. As co-investigators and co-designers has the potential to shed light on nuances and experiences of those isms of which researchers from outside of those identities may not otherwise be aware. Unfortunately, this is all under grave attack right now. In recent years, we made some incredible strides. Many federal agencies were prioritizing investment of disabled scientists. This was seen at the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, with the designation of people with disabilities as a health disparity population, which meant that NIH funding streams were opened up to those studying disability as a disparity. We created a federal evidence agenda on disability equity. These conversations were having spillover effects to the national academies. We were getting folks to pay attention to disability as principal investigator data across the entire government. We were beginning to make up for historical oppression and barriers faced by investigators with disabilities by seeing increases in things like disability supplements for accommodations and accessibility to help offset costs, and encourage investigators with disabilities to have what they need to carry out federal research agendas. When at NIDLR, we tried to make improvements on all of this across the entire research enterprise. NIDLR is dedicated to nurturing the next generation of researchers by actively involving individuals with disabilities in sponsored projects. This was highlighted in its long-range plan that I led the writing of with my previous team. We deeply integrated these principles throughout notices of funding opportunities and across NIDLR's culture. This enriches outcomes with depth and relevance. NIDLR is committed to deepening disability inclusion expectations, fostering discussions about disability identity, and creating inclusive research spaces. For example, all applicants are required to describe how input of individuals with disabilities and other key stakeholders is used to shape the proposed research activities. In 2024, NIDLR required that applicants describe in their application the racial and ethnic diversity of their target population of people with disabilities. In 2024, NIDLR updated its peer review criteria for project staff to more directly evaluate and score the extent to which applicants describe their outreach practices and encourage applications for employment from people with disabilities. In 2024, NIDLR collected optional demographic information, including of disability status of peer reviewers. These were many research policy examples being implemented and pursued to enhance disability inclusion and representation in implementation science, and really across all science. The end goal was to grow the numbers of disabled researchers in science who would be able to participate fully in federally funded research across all stages. In order to grow the field of inclusive research, it is on all of us, but especially on those of us who are already engaged in conceptualizing, conducting, and disseminating disability-related research, to be intentionally inclusive in our own practices. Further, it is on those of us who help to construct and implement research policy to adopt this inclusive mindset and lens to that work too, at all levels, in and outside of the government, within universities, and within our own research groups or teams or projects. These inclusive actions and approaches can serve as a model to others who may not think of themselves as doing or engaging in inclusive research. All research, regardless of whether the topic relates to disability, benefits from inclusive research team design. And as disability researchers, this should be the norm, not the exception. We were doing these things. Change was incremental, but it was happening. There was a heartbeat and realizations across the field and true mobilization and allyship being demonstrated. And then we get to today. I could talk about the broad ways that people with disabilities are under attack right now. There is an active lawsuit with 17 states to abolish Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act that protects us from discrimination for baseless claims that it is unconstitutional. We are facing potentially devastating cuts to Medicaid that will disproportionately harm people with disabilities. There is unfounded public blame on federal workers with disabilities for issues within the Federal Aviation Administration that is being used as an attempt to no longer support the hiring of people with disabilities in the federal workforce through a mechanism called Schedule A. But I will keep this next part focused on what is happening in science and across the research enterprise. All those diversity fellowships that we fought long and hard to include disability as eligible for, gone. For some, they were removed from the minority fellowship pool altogether and not put into the general pool. So all the years of work to secure those awards now will not even get reviewed. These minority fellowships in research provided this category to overcome past discrimination. These were meant to level the unfair playing field. Equity is based on the recognition that all people are whole and have value, disabled people too. It implies a responsibility to work to systematically and transparently operationalize and implement steps towards ensuring that all people have the opportunity to participate, in this case, in science. Diversity, equity, and inclusion accessibility DIA initiatives were developed to identify and track progress towards those goals. These traditionally silenced voices were those of diverse ideas and innovation and creativity and unique problem solving that is culturally relevant and responsive to our community's needs. What we are seeing right now is the fierce rejection that all people have inherent value and worth, and that by undercutting this diversity of thought, we go right back to maintaining the status quo of white, male, non-disabled voices as the gold standard. This is dangerous. A notice on the NIH website encouraging participation of people with disabilities in the research enterprise has been removed, as has an NSF webpage that listed funding opportunities for scientists with disabilities. Federal agencies, once proponents for increasing opportunities for scientists with disabilities, are now ceasing programs geared toward that goal. Left uncertain is how funding for disability research, from designing accessible health interventions to building better prosthetics or wheelchairs, will be affected by the order. Yes, even this. Weak, some of the funding freezes were determined to be unlawful, but in many cases grants were already terminated, and it is unclear if they will be reinstated or not. It is not that the progress on the previous is just on pause, it's actually being rolled back to much darker times. Science is being censored. National Science Foundation staff were directed to flag grants that contained buzzwords commonly associated with DEIA in project titles and abstracts including disability, ableism, and barrier, among many others. We have reason to believe this methodology will be applied across other agencies too. Scientists with disabilities are also worried about what the clampdown on accessibility will mean for both their own careers and those of the next generation. This is going to have deep ramifications for decades to come, and yet the need for more disability research still exists, just under much more challenging and tumultuous circumstances than even a couple of weeks ago. So, this is now the part where I talk about what you can do to help. How can you help to promote inclusivity and disability representation in your respective roles and based on the moment in time we are in? There is a disability community mantra of nothing about us without us. I do not want representation or inclusion of people with disabilities to be just a checkbox or an afterthought. Too often, people with disabilities are the afterthought. While this is an exceedingly complex issue to tackle, it is so important that we are gathering here today in spaces like this to have these conversations and to share tips with each other. We all are a part of the solution, and we need disabled and non-disabled to commit to the future of our field and to help us diversify the research workforce with intentionality and inclusion in mind. To help promote inclusion in all aspects of society, research must include all of us. Use your position of authority to help contextualize the harsh realities affecting students and researchers with disabilities and those who hold other marginalized identities. Right now, more than ever, and for years to come, we are going to need those voices on promotion and tenure committees and in letters of recommendation, and desperately need your advocacy that occurs behind closed doors. Look from this lens with any peer review assignment you are doing too, or in your role as editor for academic journals. Can you create intentional ways to lift up researchers with disabilities and those who with other marginalized identities? Without this allyship, we will see the demise of disabled investigators in science. Oh, and please regularly call your representatives. Look for creative ways to support disabled and minoritized scientists, things like internal funding mechanisms. The value of your mentorship just got even higher. Look for ways to support and advocate through your professional associations. Did you know that every professional association and your university has a government relations team? Talk to them, tell them you care about research policy and continued funding to support disability research. Connect disabled scientists with each other. The value of disability identity and needing each other for support right now is critical. Related, look for ways to create spaces like that for these conversations at professional conferences, at your university, in your classes. Do not become complacent. Be a part of the solution. Oh, and call your representatives regularly. The value of inclusive research cannot be underestimated. Inclusive research allows for traditionally silenced voices to be raised and to help shape the research being conducted. It is on those of us who help to construct and implement research policy to adopt this inclusive mindset and lens to that work too, at all levels, in and outside of the government, within universities, and within our own research groups or teams or projects. These inclusive actions and approaches can serve as a model to others who may not think of themselves as doing or engaging in inclusive research. All research, regardless of whether the topic relates to disability, benefits from inclusive research team design. To increase representation for those of us who are in leadership positions. Look at your hiring practices. Are people with disabilities represented? If not, why not? Are there aspects of internalized ableism that may be affecting the hiring process? In relation to research or other professional presentations, if you are asked to serve on a panel, ask who the other panelists are. Is there representation across disability or are only certain disabilities being considered highlighted? Will there be ASL and CART provided? From a broader diversity standpoint, what is the racial complexion of the panel? Does it cross your mind to ask these questions up front? These are all examples and opportunities to demonstrate allyship. Allyship involves showing up in particular ways, through action and modeling certain behaviors, but also through constant learning, shifting mindsets, and challenging dominant ideas. I wrote an article for psychologists and rehab professionals on what this means. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of these points, but they are in references. If you witness a disabled person experiencing discrimination, do you show your allyship card and act by offering of help or support? Embrace cross-cultural disability solidarity. We must value and honor the insights and participation of all of disabled community members. This also includes individuals who may be non-speaking and use alternative or augmentative communication devices. We tend to privilege those with spoken voice because of fear of the unknown. I forced you all on a journey today because of my temporary disability of being non-speaking. But this is a daily reality for so many who may not be presenting to disability-friendly audiences. Stay up to date on the direct attacks affecting disabled scientists. They are systematically being excluded from science today, and potentially in the years to come. One other big issue that must be on people's radars if it is not already, is the drastic downsizing of the federal workforce and potential plans to reorganize or restructure even places like our beloved NIDLR that is, dedicated to disability research funding. These are very precarious times. One proposal that has been floated is to absorb NIDLR into NIH. We do not know if this has credibility or teeth or how plausible this would be. But the ways that NIH approaches disability research funding are fundamentally different than how NIDLR does, with an applied approach that centers the lived experiences of people with disabilities throughout the process. Additionally, any defunding of disability research, which is systematically happening, erases our ability to have an evidence base, to measure disparities, track progress, to design tailored interventions and prove what works. Our field of disability research and livelihoods are under direct attack. As you practice anti-ableism, this means recognizing that disability is often a salient part of a person's identity. It is also exhausting to fight for our field and for our personal needs as disabled Americans too, let alone as disabled immigrants, or disabled people of color, or disabled LGBTQ members too. While we are all responsible, we don't all have to be the experts. It's important to collaborate and leverage connections to the experts and expert resources when further assistance is needed. As allies and as dismantlers of all the isms, we must also all be careful to not tokenize others. Tokenizing would be putting someone on a team, but not providing them with the supports and guidance to be able to succeed. Tokenizing would be having one sole person with lived disability experience and expecting them to speak for all, or having a disabled person on your team, but not actually listening to what they have to say, or not compensating them for their time and expertise. Tokenizing would be having a Black disabled person provide substantial input on the design of a project, but not actually be a part of collecting the data or having their name on the final published work. Tokenizing is putting this all into trying to check that box. So, as I begin to wrap up, what does it mean to achieve disability inclusivity and representation across implementation science? It means that we are not an afterthought, that we can participate in all aspects of society, including in research studies, without being perceived as a burden or an inconvenience, and that we see ourselves represented in the questions being asked, in the identities of the people in leadership. We are a value added. It means diversifying our own project teams, our co-investigators, our study participants, and ensuring that representation is carried forward in the materials we produce, and expecting this equity in our own work and in the work of others. Supporting disabled people empowers them to live full lives and to achieve their dreams. We are a value added. This shift toward inclusive thinking requires intentional foresight, commitment, communication, engagement, and openness to change practices and procedures. The value of inclusion cannot be underestimated. Involving people with disabilities in our programs and services, not just as consumers of the services, but also as colleagues, co-workers, as co-investigators and co-designers, has the potential to shed light on these types of nuances and experiences of ableism that non-disabled individuals may not otherwise be aware of. We have to meet the moment where we are at, as scary and as overwhelming as it is, and as tumultuous of a road it will be. If we do not, we run a huge risk of obliterating the field of disability research, and of even having disabled researchers. I realize this may sound extreme, but this is truly where we are at, and it will take all of us to fight for our field and for greater inclusivity and representation. We cannot ignore what is happening or be complacent. To make this a reality, we must be feisty ourselves, as Judy said, support each other, amplify each other's messages, dialogue with one another, and hold ourselves accountable on this journey. We must lift each other up, laugh, cry, get mad, and mobilize, and call your representatives. As I near closing this keynote, I think it is critical to take time to reflect on the journey we have gone on today. 1. Representation matters. 2. You can help to dismantle ableism in science. 3. You can help to foster disability identity conversations in your respective fields. 4. You can help to make our society more inclusive. 5. We need this collective action now more than ever to preserve the field of disability research. Please feel free to stay engaged with me and with AAHD. As I reflect back on Judy Heumann's words, I am so proud and honored to be a feisty disabled person changing the world, and I sure hope you'll join me too. I call on us all to be that inclusive change, ask the hard questions, engage with communities you may be less familiar with, and let's help each other to make the world a more inclusive place where all does mean all. And don't forget, call your representatives. Thank you.